Hello everyone, welcome back to the MotoGP Podcast, episode 150. Pete, you've probably been here for every single one of them, which is pretty incredible. That's a good landmark, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say, you boys have done a few on your own, though, saying that, so I'm not going to claim credit for all of those. But yeah, that is quite a lot, isn't it? Yeah.
It's an awful lot. Yeah, we're here to talk about who's going to catch Ducati. As you can hear, Pete McLaren's joining me, Jordan Morna, and Lewis Duncan is here as well. Pete, Lewis, testing's finished, thankfully. It gives us an answer into what to expect really in the early rounds, I think. But it seems that Ducati have got things sorted. Whether people are going to be like, they're standing still or not, I don't think it really matters. I think they're going to be number one still. Who's going to be behind them, Lewis? Is it going to be Aprilia? They're going to take the challenge to them early on, or is it going to be Yamaha, for example? Could that be a surprise for the first few rounds?
I think whatever happens is going to be a pretty tight battle for that second place. You know, I think we are looking at a situation where, like last year, Ducati will have the run of the championship, but there might be the odd opportunity for someone to, you know, sneak a win in there. Of course, 22-round calendar provisionally, you know, so there's a couple of more opportunities in there than there was last year. I think you're looking at Yamaha, Aprilia, kind of that's that early battle for second place, I think, and then behind it's Honda, KTM over the course of the season, and you'd like to think that Honda kind of, you know, the theory should be essentially, if you kind of look at everything kind of just in black and white and on paper, Aprilia should have a buffer in second, and then it'll kind of be Yamaha, Honda, KTM, something like that. But I think Yamaha has surprised a lot of people over the winter, especially their rivals, with the amount of work they've done. The fact they put these two extra bikes on the grid, and clearly, you know, certainly from Jack Miller's side of the garage, that's a very competitive kind of setup at the moment. You know, I think Yamaha have a really good opportunity to hit the ground running. This was a good kind of event for them last year in the dry anyway. Of course, Fabio Quartararo got punted off in the race, unfortunately, by Franco Morbidelli. But, you know, there was a good sort of place for them, and it was a good place for Honda as well. So, you know, given the problems that Aprilia have had in pre-season with missing Jorge Martin, missing Raul Fernandez for the first test, you know, that they will be on the back foot a bit, and I think that's the opportunity for at least Yamaha to start the season, you know, a little bit further ahead. But these first four rounds, as we spoke about before, Jordan, are always a bit odd. So it's pecking order kind of shifts from round to round. You get to Argentina, and sure enough, probably Aprilia will be quite strong there. You know, assuming the strong points that kept it so strong in Argentina these past few years remain. You know, it's interesting, but I think, yeah, definitely the early kind of portion of the season, Yamaha, Aprilia, that's your battle for second.
Yeah, I think so. Who do you think out of the sort of chasing pack can really establish? Because, you know, Lewis says Yamaha had a good pre-season, 4 bikes on the grid now. That's obviously a clear benefit for them, and not to say that the 2 extra bikes has just elevated the project. The bike was actually going in the right direction before that, so that automatically helps them. But Aprilia had a really tough Sepang test with them. Marco Bezzecchi and Ayogura, to his credit, you know, for a rookie being Agura, he showed really strong pace and a good time attack. But Bezzecchi really stood out with, you know, the fast lap time in Buriram, really decent sprint simulation, and let's not forget Jorge Martin will be coming back. That'll be his first weekend next week, really, on FP1. That'll be his reset again for the season. Do you think it's really between KTM, Yamaha, and Aprilia, or is it between 2 of those out of the 3?
I think it depends which riders, doesn't it? We can see that if you're talking about KTM, Acosta has looked sort of a step ahead of the others, I think, during this preseason. He's been quite bullish, isn't he, with his comments, saying, you know, I think he even described it as KTM's best preseason. But as you're saying, Ducati look a step ahead of everybody at the moment, don't they? And you know, Bezzecchi's been up there. That was impressive. I think one of the surprises. And you bring up Jorge Martin, which is the big question mark, isn't it? And I think it's good for him to have Bezzecchi up there, isn't it? Because it shows what that Aprilia can do. And what we've seen from Jorge Martin in his previous 4 years, okay, on a Ducati, is that he can basically match whatever anyone else can do on the same bike. You know, he's able to figure it out as a rider and be up there, whether it's with Pecco Bagnaia, whoever. If the bike is quick, fundamentally, he can make that bike quick. And so I think with Bezzecchi showing this bike is competitive, at least in the at Bury Run, which let's remember has not been a good track for Aprilia. It's been one of their worst, hasn't it? Which also adds to really what a good job Bezzecchi did there to be, was he top 3 on sort of lap time and then the sprint simulation quicker than anyone. Although his sprint simulation, I think the one caveat you've got to have is that Marc Marquez was just as quick as Bez, wasn't he, over those first 13 laps? But he did a full race simulation. And that just comes back to what you said on the intro, which is the Ducati is further ahead. I think that really illustrates it. Bez and Marc would have crossed the line after 13 laps. Basically, it would have been a photo finish. But then Marquez carries on and he's got another 10 laps on the bike of fuel. He's got 10 laps to do with the tyres. He's saving his energy. So that's the step that we're looking at between kind of the Ducatis of at least Marc Marquez and the others. Always a bit tricky, isn't it, to know whether you count Ducati as one manufacturer, which sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But it's almost like you somehow, sometimes the satellite bikes and the factory bikes, there's sort of a clear gap, isn't there? And you think sometimes the satellite bikes are grouped in with the Aprilias and the KTMs and the top Yamaha and Hondas. Other times they're sort of more like I was going to say the GP25s. I don't know what we call them at the moment. I guess they are still
24.9, as Bagnaia called it, I believe.
That's it, yeah. So we've got to see sort of where their position is. But certainly they start the year pretty similar on spec to the factory Ducatis, don't they? So there's 3 bikes there that will move around, the Alex Marquez and Morbidelli especially. So we've got to see where they are. But yeah, I think as far as who's going to challenge, but Bezzecchi, we've got to see, can he carry this into the race weekend? I think Quartararo, the Sepang test was more impressive. We did speak on when we were doing our podcast, Jordan, weren't we? Could they do it at Bury Run with less days on track? And that wasn't just a time thing, was it? It was a grip thing, because that's 2 less days of bikes going around, 2 less days of rubber. And we know that the Yamaha is grip dependent, isn't it? It struggles more when there's less grip normally. And I think that's why we saw them not quite as strong as at Sepang. Obviously, the tyre is a stiffer one at Bury Run as well, which adds to that. So the fact that Quartararo was up there, easily in the top 10 for lap time, decent sprint simulation as well, again, underlines that they've made progress. I think all 4 of the manufacturers have closed the gap to Ducati, obviously helped by Ducati not going with all new parts. Mm-hmm. But I think at the moment you've got Acosta as the standout at KTM. You've got Bezzecchi at Aprilia. The big question mark is Martin, Joan Mir at Honda, and Quartararo at Yamaha. And I think it's where's the average in that? I'm not quite sure. I think we have to wait till the race weekend to see where the grouping is. I think, as Lewis quite rightly said, Jack Miller's performance is interesting because he's got on that bike as somebody who's completely new to it, and he's actually been consistently fast, isn't he? Which is a good sign for that bike as far as being usable over the whole season. We're trying to predict what is going to happen over 22 rounds. And I think Gigi Dall'Igna has referenced this, talking about the engine. And you're only testing on three different tracks during the winter, aren't you? And you're trying to, how will this bike do on completely different circuits? And we don't know yet. So I think overall the good sign is that people are closer. And we've just got to see how close. But at the moment, definitely, they're all still chasing Ducati.
Yeah. It's really clear for me that you can see the steps from, maybe 3 of the 4 chasing pack, because we touched on it last week, Lewis, and KTM are the ones I'm kind of still confused about. I'm like, have they got better? Have they got worse? Have they stayed the same? Because it's been a thing, hasn't it, for years? They don't show much in testing. That's what KTM are. They piece it all together on the final day. They're even testing things in the first practice session just to try and get it right. It's worked in the past, technically. It's helped them. But I don't know if they can kind of use that same model of working again, because Aprilia have stepped up. I think that bike's get better. Yamaha, like Pete has touched on, even Honda to a degree, I think consistently they look so much better in pre-season testing than they have in, I don't know, 2 years really. This is a thing for KTM to really nail in the first part of the season, isn't it?
Yeah, I think with KTM, it's, you look at the other manufacturers and you can, maybe Honda aside, you can kind of look at those, certainly the Ducati and the Aprilia and the Yamaha, and you could look at them and go, okay, there's a clear strong point for this bike. The KTM, the riders talk about, it's got very good braking potential, but all of them seem to say the same thing, barring Pedro Acosta, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. But the KTM is good on the brakes, but can't really figure out how to really get the absolute maximum out of the braking potential to kind of make the most of it, because mid corner the KTM is fine. It's not the strongest bike, and corner exit we've heard over the years they generally have been chasing sort of rear traction. They've obviously had this vibration issue, which doesn't seem to have gone away, which is, I think, the biggest concern, because nobody else really spoke about it. I think a couple of people maybe mentioned, oh yeah, it was a little bit here and there, but not bad. Acosta is obviously the difference maker there. Is crew chief Paul Trevathan told me last year in Barcelona, like the reason they kind of went a bit backwards is that they tried to bring his braking in line with the setup of the other KTM riders, and that didn't work for Pedro. And I think we're seeing this very much borne out in the timesheets and the race runs, is that Pedro is a step ahead because his riding style is so good, is so unique, and it can take profit of that kind of what appears to be a strong point of the KTM. But when you've got a strong point of a bike that only one rider can take advantage of, how much of that is bike, how much of that is rider? And I think any success KTM has, certainly at the early part of the season, has to fully be attributed to Pedro Acosta just being the rider that he is. We saw it so many times last year, on the bike, and on a bike that doesn't really look like it's made that much of a step. It just there's nothing stands out about the KTM as being particularly revolutionary compared to some of the other bikes. The Yamaha has got a bit more top speed, a bit more usable top speed as well, which has always been a bit of an issue. It's better turning. The Honda's got better turning as well. The Aprilia seems to has a really, really strong front end, and that only seems to have gotten better, and they seem to have ironed out some of the issues that they had last year. Ducati, it's been the strongest bike for years now. The KTM thing is difficult to read, and I think Acosta will make it look better than it is, and I think those early rounds. I mean, we've seen the problems that Maverick and Ane have had on the Tech 3 bike. Bastianini says his riding style just doesn't suit this bike at all, that's a worrying thing. Yes, there's always an adaptation period, but like you look at Jack Miller, for example, he's ridden Ducati, he's ridden KTM recently. He jumped on a Yamaha, and he's like, yeah, I can adapt to that, no problem. It's a bit different, but you just have to. It's figuring out the little things, which he's clearly been able to do. So yeah, I would be worried if I was KTM, as we said, Jordan. Aki Ayo said they need to keep things simple, and yet up until the last day they were throwing 25 parts, 24 parts, this setup, that setup. Still hadn't really settled on a base bike. That's not keeping it simple. And I think that's always been KTM's problem, is that they throw all this stuff at it. And Brad Binder kind of alluded to this at the end of last year, is that they need to really settle on something and then build on it, but they just throw parts at it and kind of hope that it sticks. I mean, Pete, I'm sure you remember in that first KTM season when they were bringing, 17, 18 different chassis, to a test. It's like that's too confusing, and it doesn't really seem like they've figured out how to simplify things, and that's going to be a problem.
Pete, anything to add to that?
I think one thing that stood out, just looking at one concern, if I was KTM and I'm Acosta, is looking at the last laps of his race simulation. The times increased at he's into the 32s, and there's been a few pictures that have emerged of sort of the rear tyres of the KTM, and I think they might have a tyre wear issue towards the end of the race, which again is something that they've struggled with in the past. Now, that presumably wouldn't be an issue in the sprint, but potentially looking at the way that the lap times did rise in those last 2 or 3 laps. And it wasn't just the last lap, so it wasn't just Acosta backed off. It's the last couple of laps. So he's tried to keep it going, and it's still going into the 32s. And so that's something that I think they're going to have to get on top of for the Grand Prix weekend, potentially. The chatter issue is still there, as Lewis quite rightly said. I know that the riders don't bring it up, but when they're asked about it, they have to admit that it is still there. Other teams, other riders from other manufacturers have kind of said the same thing, but again, that's something that was holding them back last year. It's interesting about all the parts and things, isn't it? Because this 25 bike, we saw wildcard with Pol Espargaro quite early on last year, wasn't it? It'd be quite, you never quite know what parts are being tested when, but how different is the bike that they were running, let's say, in these winter tests from that bike that Pol Espargaro had? Because in theory, it should be quite well sorted. They were almost, they were ahead of the game in that respect, weren't they? They were putting their 25 bike on the track and wildcarding it during last season. So I'm not sure how much the bike has changed since then. They seem happy enough with the engine. That's the good thing is the KTM seems like, if you're KTM, it's the most powerful engine still. And obviously with Ducati rolling back, shall we say, to the 24 engine, that removes that threat as well. It sounds like Aprilia have got more top end power as well. So potentially, if you're looking for a vulnerability at Ducati, maybe they could be in trouble on the straights a little bit, just because they haven't kept that endless sort of evolution of engine performance going. But yeah, I think you're looking at the general trends. You're looking at where are all of the KTM riders, as you guys quite rightly say. The Tech 12 guys were way back, weren't they, for really most of the tests, both tests this year in Sepang and Bury Run, and that's going to be a concern. Vinales sort of made a bit of a late breakthrough with on the timesheets, didn't he, at Bury Run? He obviously has that experience of riding lots of different bikes. This is his fourth different bike in MotoGP. So you would expect him to sort of adapt to it. As has been said, Bastianini, this is the first time he's ridden anything but a Ducati, and you never quite know which way it will go. Bez is in the same situation. Martin's in the same situation. Always a bit of a gamble, isn't it? You never quite know when somebody's only ever ridden one type of bike, how they'll go on something different. And as Lewis has explained, it sounds like Bastianini's really struggling with using the rear brake that was great on the Ducati. The KTM doesn't like it. And Brad Binder was explaining, backing up what Lewis was saying about Acosta using these different lines that really seem to work well with the KTM. And he was going to sort of look at it, maybe try and do some of that himself, because it's not the obvious, let's say, thing to do, but Acosta's proving that it works. So Acosta is already, just his feel for the machinery, I guess, has worked out that's the tighter lines into the corners are actually beneficial on the KTM.
Lewis?
Yeah, just picking up on that. It's a good point that Pete raises about that 2025 sort of prototype, because we kind of came into this year thinking, with all the issues with KTM, that actually they were in quite a good position. After the Barcelona test, the riders were quite positive about it. There was a lot of good points he picked up on it. You do have to wonder is how much of that sort of prototype bike that they tested last year, and I assume was the same version that was tested in Barcelona, there were parts of that were earmarked to be developed on and improved on to kind of unlock a bit more performance, and all that stopped with the financial issues. The KTM have said that everything was budgeted for 2025, but obviously winter development probably wasn't. That probably must come in from a different budget that may well have been stopped. They've obviously been losing staff. There's a lot of problems going on at KTM, and maybe they've not been able to, things like wind tunnel time as well. That's a big expense that they might not have been able to justify. We saw that kind of unique aero at Barcelona that never really seemed to emerge again in Sepang or Buriram. So you do wonder how much the KTM had a plan for that bike and knew exactly what way it was going to develop it, and then that was stopped. So they've had to kind of basically mix and match with that bike and 2024 parts to try and kind of extract the maximum out of it. And if that is the case, then we're obviously still not sure what KTM's kind of future is. And is that going to be a more ongoing problem this year, as if they virtually can't put anything new on the bike? And so yeah, neither of the factory riders spoke during that Buriram test. It's kind of left the door open a little bit to wondering, why. There's the Tech 3 riders spoke to us. Why didn't the factory riders spoke to? Is there maybe some more issues with that bike than is being let on, that maybe the two new riders aren't going to divulge as much because they've got, they need to adapt to the bike, whereas Pedro and Brad know the bike a bit more intimately. So yeah, it's hard to come away from the preseason and not just look at the KTM situation and wonder how much of the overall kind of financial crisis is impacting this and just how bad it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I hear both of you talk about Pedro Acosta being the one to kind of mask the issues, we've kind of heard it before with a certain Honda and a 93 and that sort of, not going to get to that stage, but it kind of reminds me of this. And it's like you're kind of seeing the talent outweigh the bike. And I think in the early rounds, I kind of fear for Acosta sometimes. I'm thinking, please don't override this thing and potentially have a crash, or we've seen that in the past with Marquez, for example, chasing it, knowing that he can make the difference, but the bike's not up to it, and then you have crashes essentially. And I think Acosta, he's desperate to get that first win. I think it eats away at him, knowing last year it was right there at certain points. And yeah, all the uncertainty off the track. I know that he's kind of said everything's fine at the Sepang test, and I think deep down it's like he just wants to win, and who knows what's going to happen this season with him in terms of contracts for the future and everything. That this is the underlying point for me. It's like, well, if everything's not going well off the track for KTM, what point does he kind of look at it and go, I might need to go somewhere else, try and get an opening somewhere if I can. So yeah, the worrying thing for me, Pete, as well, Lewis said about Bastianini. I mean, I've looked at photos of majority of KTM riders. Maverick was using pretty much what Pedro and Brad had. But Anea was kind of last few hours, only switching really to what they had. He was running like older aero from Jack Miller that we seen last year. And he has like obviously a lot of tank sort of modifications to make him feel comfortable in terms of braking and entry. That is a worry for me. He is a really sensitive rider, it seems. Even from his Ducati days, it seems that he was like that. He needs somewhere to be in a window where he can really exploit the tyres. But the KTM's really weak on its tyres, and he's not going to be able to maximise like he's done on the Ducati, for example, and he's struggling with braking and corner entry. Is this going to be a season for, not to forget for Anea, but one that's really going to take a while to get going?
As I say, it's always a worry, isn't it, when you change bikes and are you going to suit it? And as you say, Bastianini, we saw the GP23, wasn't it? There's an example of him never really feeling comfortable on that bike. Obviously, he had injuries that year at the factory team in 2023, but even when he wasn't injured, he never really figured it out, shall we say, in the way that the others were able to sort of make the bike work, weren't they? And, he's now in a situation where, a bit similar to that, I guess, where he kind of has to figure out this bike. He's got other riders, the other three riders are going quicker than him. So, the factory's they're not going to move it more in his direction when you've got three guys quicker than you. And the first thing he needs to do is to get up there with those other riders on the KTM so that, he can then, his voice becomes louder, doesn't it? KTM have made clear, haven't they? If they only have one of a new part, it goes to whoever is fastest. They don't care who that is of their four riders, but it's very much on performance. And I think it works. You can turn that the other way around. If you're at the back of the queue in terms of performance, they're not going to be building special parts to suit whatever you need. So, yeah, it's as you say, it's worrying because it's two different tracks, 5 days now, isn't it? Really, and he's still not looking comfortable or anything like comfortable on the bike. And there's only a short time between, obviously, the Birmingham test and the Birmingham race weekend. So exactly what they can change in that short period of time, I'm not sure. But it might be that, these early rounds are going to be really an extension of testing for Bastianini, perhaps, in trying to get, as you say, just fundamentally comfortable on the bike, as far as the way he fits on it and everything else. Because if he's not even feeling comfortable in that sense, it's hard to believe that he can be fast on it. So they've got to get the sort of the fundamental parts sorted, haven't they? He's got to build confidence in the bike as well. As he said, he's got to understand how to use the braking on the bike, to get the speed out of it. It does seem like it's quite a different bike to the Ducati. That's pretty clear, I guess. When people look at the KTM and the Ducati, sometimes they, from the outside, the way you ride them almost looks similar, doesn't it? But clearly, they are different in that crucial area of braking and corner entry. So, yeah, let's see what the beast can do. But there's very short amount of time. As I say, it's going to be more. I think he's going to have to make this difference. That's where the quickest change will come from. He's going to have to sit down with his engineers, or they're going to have to go over the data and go, look, can you try this? Can you try that? That's the best way forward for him, I think, in the short term, because I don't see the bike changing. Let's put it that way. I don't think they're going to fundamentally alter the bike. He's going to have to work out how to get at least the same amount of speed from it as the other three guys.
Yeah, he talked about him and Alberto Girabiola kind of were working in the Ducati way the first few days of the test, and they realised it's not working here. Our kind of approach, we need to change it, which I think it's good if you're recognising that early. But Lewis, this is a comparison. Does Bastianini remind you of like Marco Melandri or anything? He reminds me of someone like that, who when they would change manufacturer, it would take a while for it to even work. And like I think of Melandri when he went to Ducati, for example, it was a disaster. And you look back at that in I think it was 2008 or 2008. Like Bastianini seems in that sort of mold. He's very hypersensitive to change and adaptation. Because you talked about Jack Miller, which is a really valid point. You see Miller who's able to adapt, but this for Bastianini is becoming really just uncomfortable for him when he's saying it after testing and he can't really be suited to this bike yet. It's worry, isn't it?
Yeah, especially when kind of ostensibly the best part about the bike is the braking, which in theory should be where Bastianini excels. So even it's like I'm saying, it's strong on the braking, but is that really kind of the strong suit of the KTM? I think that's the unknown quantity. You jump on Aprilia, for example, and Bez was like, front end, best front end I've ever had, and Martin said the same thing, Ducati riders have always said strong braking. The Yamaha has always been good at cornering. That was something that Jack Miller noted, was really, really good at corner entry. I think what we were saying as well with Bastianini, I think this probably applies to some other riders on the grid, is that when you have a manufacturer with a bike as good as Ducati, where at points there was 8 of them on the grid, and that's where a lot of riders are making their debuts on. I think what we're seeing is perhaps, and I know this will probably come in for a bit of stick for this, is that the quality of rider on those bikes who are then getting factory opportunities maybe isn't as great as those results on that bike have suggested. Ine was really good on the Ducati in his first year, comparatively to some of the other satellite riders, but that's because that even that spec of Ducati with the GP20, whatever it was that they were riding at the time, was really kind of essentially a GP19 given the code phrases, but that was a really sorted, decent bike. 2022 went on to win races, great, but you look at who else was able to win races in 2022. Yamaha was able to do it, but were slided down the grid, and it was only with Fabio Quartararo because Fabio's a super talent. 2023, we've just seen this total domination from Ducati, very few others getting involved in the mix, same last year. You look at riders like Bastianini, you look at riders like Marini, when he jumped on the Honda last year, it took him until half the season to get a point, and that point was only because there was a penalty given in the race to another rider. You're seeing things like that. You're seeing, Digia has had some good results, but if Digia was to move on to a factory team and to a better, we'll kind of get a little bit of a clue of that this year, but like, just going from Ducati to Ducati is largely going to be okay for you. But when obviously there was that 23 season where that GP23 was not a great bike, and obviously riders like Ine struggled. And then we saw last year, we saw riders like Bez struggle, and we saw, Alex Marquez was kind of largely one of the better riders on that, and Digia was okay as well. But those riders weren't at the same kind of level as what that bike could be brought to, which Mark Marquez proved. So I do wonder if maybe we're kind of going to see over the next sort of couple of seasons, if obviously the KTM project goes that far, has the kind of hype around Enea Bastianini maybe been a bit over-egged? Has it been a bit masked by the fact that he's had, when he was good, he was on really good machinery, and when he finally switches to something that requires a bit of, talent to really bring it through, is that talent as kind of prominent as maybe we've been led to believe? I think that's going to be a question for a couple of riders, well, like Bez, for example. I think Bez is already proving that actually maybe he is a bit more, a bit more suited to being a factory rider than perhaps he maybe showed in those kind of first few years of VR46. As much as his speed was there, but it's one thing to have flashes of speed; you need it consistently in MotoGP. So yeah, I just wonder if this is maybe kind of an element of that, is maybe that Bastianini's struggling because he's not as good a rider as perhaps we've been led to believe. And we've seen this before for a lot of riders. Jack Miller's a good example of that. How many years have we listened to people going, "Oh, Jack Miller's this, he's so good, he's one of the fastest riders out there." You look at his results. I think this will be the real kind of making of Enea Bastianini, and will really filter out as to where he does genuinely sit in this pecking order, because even last year when the bike was good, he didn't have that many injury problems. He wasn't exactly consistently winning races. In fact, he was a lot of the time not consistently that close to the other GP24s. So I think, as hard as it is to kind of accept, I think we have to that's what we're seeing here. Is that maybe the struggles here are down to the fact that Bastianini isn't as factory quality a rider as maybe has been painted out.
Yeah, I think we'll wait and see with Finea. I hope it turns around, because I think if he can show, like, when he, as you say, the Ducati has helped, I think, in certain elements of his MotoGP career so far. But when you see what he can do, it's like, well, surely there's something in there. He's a world champion too, and you're like, well, if he could show it. But I think the step for me is just a bit too much this year for him. I think the KTM is so different, but it has things that should work in his favor, but we're not seeing it. Because I think Mavericks came in a bit more confident. On to Mavericks' credit, he said they did make a breakthrough, and if you look at it that way, Mavericks wrote a lot of MotoGP bikes, and if he's making adaptation point now, that's good for Maverick. But for Enea, it's like kind of in the open seas, open waters now, because you've had that luxury of being on a Ducati, and it's like, this is a completely different beast now compared to what I was used to.
And remember what he said in the winter, this can't become like a Ducati. The KTM has to stay KTM, and I think he's probably going to start maybe regretting that.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a really tough season for Enea. I just think back to people who have jumped across on different machines in the past and how they've struggled. And I think they've become like a shadow of themselves almost. You think of Joan Mir on the Honda for the first 2 years. It looks like it's getting better now for Mir, but he looked completely lost at points of last year. And yeah, just Luca Marini as well is a good point. Adaptation from Ducati to Honda. You've seen, like you said, Lewis, only got a point really because of a tire pressure penalty for someone else, but at least Marini's making gains now. We're kind of seeing it get better, but like, yeah, I think that's a good comparison. So it is for what the season is ahead for Bastianini. And the final question really for kind of us to agree on, can we agree on a top 5 order of the manufacturers heading into the first round? I'll put it out here. I think that Honda are going to be 5th. Can we agree on that? Or has anyone got any different opinions of it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Joan Mir, he's and an interesting point you raise about Mir, because I think it's almost the opposite situation to Bastianini, where he's now got the competitive bike, isn't he? And I think where was he last year? He was like 20th in the standings or something. Basically
21st. Yeah.
That wasn't the real Joan Mir. In the point I'm making is, now that he's got a bike that he has confidence in, that he can ride, I think it's almost, it's like 2 steps. One is from the bike and one is from him, because we know that he's got that skill there, that talent, and now that he's getting the bike under him, I think we saw at Honda almost this situation where it was, look, there's no point throwing it down the road all the time. He got injured quite a lot, didn't he? Trying to wring the last 10th of a second out of a bike for 15th place or something, and then ending up, in the medical center. And I think now the bike has caught up, if you know what I mean. Now we're starting to see the real Joan Mir come back. And so that's why I think that the step that he's made in the timesheets, which is quite dramatic, I think it's not all come from the bike. I think it's coming from the bike and from him going, okay, right, now I've got something I can use. And we're starting to see a bit more the real sort of Joan Mir. So, yeah, I think... but yeah, coming back to your statement there, John. Yeah, I mean, because qualifying is so important. That's why I'm hesitating. And I think he's been able to pull out a fast lap, hasn't he, at Sepang and now at Buriram. And even if he can just qualify well, if he could just hang in there, isn't it, in the race? If you can get a decent start and then just hang in there, you can get a good result. So yeah, I'm not sure, because it's Buriram. I think that the way that he went with his, obviously 6th fastest, I think, overall in the test. He did that really pretty impressive sprint simulation as well, where he was pretty close to Bez, I think, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
So I think Mir could be in there fighting, with Quartararo, the KTMs even, maybe, as I say, maybe with the exception of Acosta, depending on that tyre wear and things like that towards the end. But I don't know. I've been impressed by Mir, I have to say. I think he's been one of the surprises further down the order. There's been a few of the preseason. You mentioned Bezzecchi, you guys, and things like that. But I think Mir that was a big step that we saw from him and Honda.
This is a difficult list to put together now. Because like I have Ducati at 1 and I have Aprilia at 2. So I'm like, who's 3, 4, and 5 here? Is this going to be all different for us? Lewis, what do you think?
I agree on the Joan Mir point. I think what we've seen with Joan Mir as well is over those first 2 years at Honda, he's obviously the first year was injury hit like mad, and he came back, and at a lot of points he was like, I did think about quitting here. And then it was kind of the same last year. There was a point in those contract negotiations where we were kind of hearing that, he's kind of considering retiring rather than moving elsewhere in the grid. He doesn't just want to make up the numbers. And I think now that he's committed to that, he knows he has to put 2 years into this now. So I think, like Pete says, more than anything, it's just been this mental shift. And I think Joan Mir is now finally kind of emerging as that world champion leader that Honda really kind of needed him to be in the first place. But, you can understand coming from that Suzuki situation where the rug was pulled out from under them, and, he was in the middle of contract negotiations at the time, both Suzuki and Honda, and then all of a sudden his only option was Honda, and you can understand where that kind of fell off a bit. I think in terms of order, Ducati, number 1.
Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. It's a terrible time of the year for colds and stuff. It's just as Pete Wells knows from. But yeah, injury on the injury sidelines with Jorge Martin for a pesky flu or cold or whatever it was. I think Ducati, I think is Aprilia number 2 because Bez has been really impressive, but obviously we haven't really seen what Jorge Martin can do, and we haven't seen what Bez can do in that race situation. I think is the other thing.
They are too. I think they're just. It's like just about. So it is.
I think it's probably Ducati, Aprilia, Yamaha, Honda, KTM. Yes, I know KTM has Pedro Acosta, but Pedro Acosta had a tendency last year to throw it down the road, and we haven't yet seen if he can change that. And B, as Pete says, the tyre wear thing is kind of a concern. Nobody else seems to have that quite dramatic drop off. And if you look at the other kind of race simulations we saw from the KTM riders in Buriram, they weren't great. Like Brad Binder's long run simulation was kind of on a par with Zarco's on the Honda, and that was a bike that was reasonably competitive at Buriram last year with Zarco. So I think that's my order. KTM, KTM 5th, then Honda, then Yamaha, Aprilia, Ducati.
We've got the same top 3, so we do, because I have Ducati, Aprilia, Yamaha, and I've went KTM 4th, Honda 5. But Honda being 5 isn't a bad thing, because I think if we're having a scale, if it had been last year, the Honda would be like, they'd be like 4th, and then they'd be like 9th on my scale if it looks in my head. But like now they're in a 5th place, but they're closer.
It's like a 5th that sits on the borderline of 4.
Yeah, they're like sitting there, so they are. That's mine. Only difference between mine and Lewis, we've swapped KTM and Honda. Pete, you can give us your one. You're not getting any deciding votes here. We'll just kind of, just kind of,
I'm keeping faith in Pedro Acosta. I just that he's going to hang in there, that he's going to qualify decently. He's going to pull up one, he'll do the fast lap and then just bring it home. As I say, this is the difficulty, is separating the bike from the rider, isn't it? And so I just think that Acosta, he's a fighter, and he's just looked up for it. He's always been he's quite combative, in his dealings with the media, and he just looks like somebody who's ready to go race and fight, basically. And I think maybe with the KTM situation as well, he knows that their backs are all against the wall. They really, really need results, don't they? They really need to with everything that's going on, they need to come out fast. I think he's shown he can do a fast lap, and I just think if he can start up there, Acosta being Acosta, like you say, it could be like Japan. Maybe he'll overcook it and it'll all go wrong. But I think he can. He's got the pace to qualify there. Yeah, I think he'll hang in there. I'll go Ducati, Aprilia, KTM, and then behind KTM, I'll say Honda and Yamaha again. It's Mir and Honda, Quartararo and Yamaha. I'll go Quartararo. I think over a race, I think we'll get the better of Mir. Let's put it that way. So yeah. But I think it's going to be close. Yeah, I think that as we've been saying, it's a lot closer, and it will be mixed up. I don't think there is going to be this clear distinction between, let's say, the 5 brands.
Yeah, we'll see when we get on track for practice, and it's going to be completely wrong, isn't it? It's going to be like Aprilia top, KTM second, Ducati third, and then we're going to completely made a mug out of it. But I don't know. We'll see what happens after the first round. Next week, we'll have our season preview, really, where we'll give our predictions for the championship and kind of give out like certain topics, but we'll give our thoughts on that. And then we're into the race weekend schedule. Then there'll be a podcast again after that. And then it's pretty much normal for the full season. So, yeah, MotoGP's back. And, yeah, we're here to cover it all. And if you enjoyed watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, tell us who you think is the closest manufacturer to Ducati. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, 5-star review helps us out massively. Yeah, all that business. Help us out to get us up the charts. Get MotoGP out there. Get more people listening and interacting about the sport. I think it only helps. So it does. Until next time, we'll see you then.